Welcome back. Iran and the terror group Hamas have expressed their condolences to the victims of this weekend's shooting massacre at the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh.
Iran's Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif wrote on Twitter, quote, "Extremism and terrorism know no race or religion and must be condemned in all cases. The world deserves better than to have to live with weaponized demagoguery."
Hamas also denounced this weekend's violence, but then also went on to describe themselves as the victims of the terror of Israeli occupation. For more on this, let's bring back in Ambassador Danny Danon, Israel's permanent representative to the United Nations. Ambassador, how do you see these reactions, these condemnations coming from Iran, from Hamas? Is that surprising? Is
This is ridiculous. We don't buy it. You know, in Iran, every year they have a competition for Holocaust denier. And they're paying thousands of dollars for the winners. Hamas, they're teaching the children to kill Jews every day. So we don't buy those empty remarks. If they really believe it, they should change what they're teaching in schools, change what they are doing in the streets. So they're taking advantage of this unfortunate reality.
So what are they up to? Is it just they're trying to be clever about their PR? I mean, what drives them? I mean, why not just say nothing if they really feel that, you know, Jews deserve to be dead and the Holocaust never happened and they want to expunge Jews from wherever? Why not say nothing?
Because sometimes they are trying to pretend that they belong to the Western societies, that they have some kind of a rule of law. It is not the case. Those regimes have no rule of law and are full of hatred and incitement.
Ambassador, today, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas said that the PLO will no longer recognize the state of Israel, and it just seems like instead of going forward with negotiations, the two sides are going backwards. Does it concern you or even surprise you that Abbas is using this rhetoric?
It is unfortunate, but it's not a surprise. It's not the first time, by the way, that he's saying the same thing and he's threatening. He's saying no to the U.S. involvement, he's saying no to the UN involvement, and he's saying no to the Israeli cooperation. By the way, the cooperation between the Israelis and the Palestinians is important to Abbas himself. You know, in the past, we actually provided information that saved Abbas's life. So I think he will have to consider very well before he decides to cut the connections with Israel.
Every Friday, there have been large demonstrations along the Gaza border fence. Some Palestinian militants have thrown rocks and bottles and hand grenades. Israeli troops have opened fire with tear gas and live fire. Palestinians have been killed. And then there have also been the rocket attacks fired from Gaza into Israel and Israel with airstrikes in response. How does this end? I mean, how does it wind down?
Those are not demonstrations. Those are riots, orchestrated riots by Hamas. And I think they are using those people and sending them to the fence. So it's up to Hamas to decide whether they want to continue or to stop with that. We have no intention to see any escalation in the region. But at the same time, if they will send rockets to our cities, we will respond.
But on one hand, there are still talks of ceasefire with Hamas going on. Israeli Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman, however, he's not a big proponent of this process. He thinks that Israel should give Hamas a major blow and end the circle or get quiet for just a while. Which approach do you support? What do you think is the right way to go about this?
Prime Minister Netanyahu is very clear on this issue. If there will be quiet in Israel, it will be quiet in Gaza. If it will not be quiet in our towns, we will chase the Hamas leaders, and they should know we do have the capabilities to hit them hard. We have no intention for that, but if we have no choice, we will show them the might of the IDF.
Is there also an opportunity, though, for more humanitarian aid to go in if they're quiet along the border? If these were to stop, would that open up border crossings and allow more supplies to go in?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, Abbas himself is blocking humanitarian support to the people of Gaza. Qatar offered to transfer more funds so they will have more than 4 hours of electricity a day. And we support that. He is blocking those initiatives. He's actually working against the well-being of the Palestinians in Gaza.
Ambassador, I want to end this on a more positive tone because over the last couple of days, we've seen the Israeli national anthem being played in Abu Dhabi after an Israeli judo star won a tournament there. And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his wife Sarah, they had a very rare visit to Oman. This for sure marks a certain change towards Israel in the region. Do you feel this in the United Nations?
First, we are very happy that we won 2 gold medals. Usually it doesn't happen. And yes, we feel that change. I visited Dubai 2 years ago, and as you mentioned, the Prime Minister visited Oman, and usually it happens quietly. And I think it is about time that we will walk, you know, above the ground, and we will have a public cooperation with those important countries.
Ambassador Danny Danon, thanks for coming into our studio.
Thank you very much.
Good to see you.
Thank you.
There has been a horrific commercial jetliner crash off the coast of Indonesia. A Boeing 737 with 189 people on board plunged into the sea off of Jakarta moments after takeoff.
The crash comes at a time when the aviation industry in Indonesia and across the region is facing serious questions about safety protocols. Correspondent David Carley has more.
Pieces of the brand new 737 being pulled from the waters off Indonesia. No sign of survivors of the 189 who were on board for the short early morning flight from Jakarta. Just 13 minutes after takeoff, the jet with a child and 2 infants among those on board fell out of the sky. This FlightAware map showing the path right after takeoff for what was to be a little more than an hour flight to an island when the jet disappears. And officials say it stopped sending locating signals. Search crews have found personal effects, IDs, and life vests, some up to 2 miles away from the crash site in the Java Sea, as families then rushed to the airport to learn any news. The 737 MAX 8 had just been delivered to the low-cost Indonesian airline in August. The president of Lion Air saying that the jet had what he described only as a technical issue on its last flight, but it was a problem that was fixed.
That was David Curley reporting, and according to BBC, this technical issue that David Curley mentioned there, it was that the airspeed reading on the captain's instrument was unreliable, but we don't know if that's what happened.
And that's a major problem for Boeing, if in fact that's true, because this is a relatively new aircraft. Boeing just gave it to this airline just a couple of months ago. It hasn't been in service for very long. Boeing officials are now headed to Indonesia as part of the investigation, but that's it's very sad to hear.
It is. We'll hope we'll get some answers about what happened there soon. There is new information on the death of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Saudi Arabia's chief prosecutor has met with his counterpart in Turkey. Khashoggi was reportedly tortured and killed at Saudi Arabia's consulate in Istanbul earlier this month.
Turkish prosecutors are demanding that Saudi Arabia extradite to Turkey the 18 suspects believed to be involved in Khashoggi's murder. Turkish officials also want to know what happened to Khashoggi's body.
Those who are responsible for this premeditated murder were arrested in Saudi Arabia. They are carrying out an investigation as well. We think it's useful that the prosecutors work together and share information. They must continue to cooperate, but this should not be extended over a period of time, and there should be no stalling. This is our concern. This investigation must be concluded as soon as possible. The whole world awaits the outcome. The whole truth must be revealed.
Amidst all of this, there is a bombshell new report claiming Britain knew about the plot to kill Khashoggi and begged Saudi Arabia to abort the plan.
According to the British newspaper The Sunday Express, the plot against Khashoggi reportedly developed because he was about to disclose details about Saudi Arabia's alleged use of chemical weapons in Yemen. The Sunday Express also wrote that the UK knew about the plot 3 weeks before the murder.
President Trump has said we will get to the bottom of this, and certainly Turkey, with the evidence that they have compiled, will ensure that there is more than one review of what is going on here, and I'm certain the investigation will include the evidence that Turkey has put forward so far, and the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia has assured me that it will be a full investigation just yesterday in Bahrain.
And that, of course, was the U.S. Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis. He says that the United States is still pledging to shed some light on what happened to Khashoggi. For more, let's bring in our senior diplomatic correspondent, Nina Larson in Washington. And Nina, does this report from the Brits, from the British newspaper, does it say anything about Saudi Arabia's crown prince and his alleged involvement in the murder?
Well, yes and no, David, and I have to emphasise you're quite right. This is just one report in one British newspaper citing unnamed intelligence sources, but this would take this story on a very interesting turn if this indeed is true, if there's any element of truth to all of this. But the interesting thing is that this report, as it's reported in the Express, does not directly, it's not detailed enough to directly tie the Crown Prince to all of this. They're not even sure, says the report, if he was actually aware. So, you know, this would cast doubt on some of the allegations, the very serious allegations lodged at him throughout the week. But it would also, if proved to be true, would show a very clear motivation for the Saudis wanting to silence this journalist if indeed he did have that kind of evidence. This would be a whole new element to that war in Yemen, that already long and painful and very, very unpopular war, especially in Britain, actually. They've stood very firmly against the war in Yemen and the use of airstrikes. So if there's another element to this, the use of chemical weapons, that would be very serious for Saudi Arabia yet again.
And looking to Yemen, Nina, there are some shocking new figures from aid agencies this week.
That's right. So the situation in Yemen getting ever worse, particularly for children. Tal, UNICEF has just released a report saying 1.8 million children are in absolute dire need there, and 400,000 of them could actually die if they're not given urgent care for malnutrition. But look at the ingredients in this situation. It's a perfect storm. There's cholera, there's bad sanitation or no sanitation, there's no clean water, and it's almost impossible in the conflict zone that it is for any international aid to get through. So it's a very, very critical situation there in Yemen, particularly for child civilians.
Anina, turning to Syria, the leaders of Russia, France, and Germany were in Istanbul, Turkey over the weekend discussing what the post-war country will look like. Any progress?
Not really, David. If anything, this summit just showed how little progress there has been made. The US was absent. There were no representatives from the Syrian government or the Syrian opposition. What we did have is at least a show of unity between France, Germany and Russia and Turkey, but lots of lofty ideals about long-held ceasefires and constitutions and elections. But as I said, the key players were not involved in all of this. The constitution drafting efforts by the UN are absolutely frozen. And as we know, Staffan de Mistura, the special envoy from the United Nations to this peace process, is stepping down at the end of this month.
Nina Larson, our senior diplomatic correspondent, reporting tonight from Washington. Nina, thank you. In Syria, there are some new signs of stability. The country's National Museum has reopened to the public for the first time since it was forced to close 6 years ago, and that was at the onset of the Civil War.
At the time, most of the collection was evacuated and kept at secret locations to keep exhibits safe. Syria's culture minister said the reopening of the museum sent a genuine message that the country's rich cultural heritage was not destroyed by terrorism.
Paul, it's so interesting that, I mean, look, in some parts of Syria, Damascus areas that the regime has had control of.
There's life.
Yeah, there's life. And life is going back to normal. You can see the shops are still open. There are television broadcasts. People are going to the theater. All the sort of trappings of daily life continue. And then you have areas where the rebels are still in some control.
Could become museums themselves.
Yeah, it's just sort of being destroyed. And so in the midst of all of this, there are those leaders from Turkey and Russia who are trying to figure out, oh, what should Syria look like when this is all over? Well,
good question. It is, I mean, marking an end to the Syria civil war in a sense, but it tells us that it's going somewhere. But the question of the Idlib province is still very prominent. There's a ceasefire. Will it hold water? I don't think President Assad, will he just live with the status quo, the fact that there are rebels over there, or not?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
All right, still ahead, in the wake of the tragic shooting at the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh, President Trump is now lashing out at the media and blaming the media in part for anger across the United States.
And that is not sitting well with a lot of people. And as the suspect in last week's mail bombings appears in court, another suspicious package that he sent out before his arrest in Florida was just intercepted. We'll get an update on the mail bomber and have the debate over President Trump when Crossroads on I24 News continues.